Our gospel lesson this morning is from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 14, verses 13 through 21. It would help us to know that right before this is the death of John the Baptist. King Herod has John the Baptist executed. I invite us, out of respect, let us honor the reading of the gospel this morning. As you're able, please stand. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. And when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the towns. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is late. Send the crowds away so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Matthew says Jesus has gone into the wilderness. He has intentionally wandered into a deserted place. Jesus has gotten the news about his cousin, John the Baptist. John had been executed by King Herod. Presumably, Jesus is grieving this loss. And so, as he does sometimes in the Gospels, he withdraws from the disciples and from people in order to have solitude, in order to have prayer. But Matthew tells us the crowds follow him out into the wilderness, and before you know it, it is dinner time, and there's no food. The disciples say they only have just a few biscuits and some fish sticks, and they say, we don't have enough. Now, it helps to note that in the first century Mediterranean world, food scarcity was rampant. The rich and the elite had adequate access to 3 meals a day, but the poor, they were lucky to get 3 meals a week. That's why Jesus' promise in the Lord's Prayer of daily bread, that is why that is so poignant. Caesars and kings could give daily bread. We might assume that the crowd that has followed Jesus out into the wilderness, some in the crowd might also be grieving the loss of John. John was the voice of the one crying out in the wilderness, preparing the way of the Lord. John was the voice heralding God's coming one who would bring hope. And now that voice is silenced. So as far as we know, this crowd is not simply following a celebrity Messiah in the hopes of getting a free meal. Now before this, in previous chapters in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus has done some miraculous deeds, but it is not yet known Jesus could do something of this level. They are wandering around, this crowd, they are wandering around hopeless, which is why Matthew says Jesus looks at them and has compassion. I may have mentioned before that English word that we translate as compassion, it's really too polite. It's too elegant of a word to give you an idea of what Jesus felt. The Greek word behind that English word compassion, the Greek word, one of my favorite Greek words, it's splagnutsomai, and it literally means to be moved in the bowels. It's where we get the idea of being gut-wrenched. When the disciples saw the crowds, they saw potential freeloaders, people who should have planned better. They should have packed their own meals. They should have just stayed home. They should have just lived within their means, not have to depend on handouts. But when Jesus looks at the crowds, he is gut-wrenched, splangnitzomide. He is heartbroken. The disciples tell Jesus to send the crowds back home. Let them buy their own food. Let them fend for themselves. Survival of the fittest and all that. And in response, Jesus looks at the disciples and says, oh, well, we don't need to send them home. You give them something to eat. You feed them. No wonder the disciples were shocked. Jesus orders the disciples to feed the crowds out of the scarcity of their food, out of the scarcity of what little they have. Matthew does not tell us exactly how this miracle happened, how a meager amount of fish and bread multiplied to feed a crowd of thousands. And maybe that shouldn't be our primary focus. Certainly it's significant. But there are plenty of other religious leaders in antiquity who are credited with doing some type of miracle or mighty deed. What makes this meal in the wilderness so interesting is that it is a kind of mirror or a kind of parody of a meal that preceded it. What comes before this passage was another meal that took place in the court of King Herod. It was a dinner party that was attended by the rich and the elite. There was lots of food, plenty of food to go around. There was lots of wine, and King Herod was drinking a lot, and he got drunk, and he swore a drunken oath. And he ends up having John the Baptist beheaded and his head put on a platter for all to see. One minute, Matthew focuses on a lavish party where only the 1% was invited, where death was on display. And the next minute, Matthew turns our attention to a very different meal, a banquet that took place not in a palatial court, but out in the wilderness. And it was a party that was not exclusive with a limited guest list. It was a meal with an open invitation that echoed the words of the prophet Isaiah, "Come all who are hungry and thirsty." It was a banquet where what looked like scarcity turned out to be, in Jesus' good hands, great abundance. It was a banquet where life and not death was on display, where Israel's true king was fulfilling the promises of God, that the sick would be healed, the poor would be fed, and the downtrodden would be lifted up. It was a party in which uncertain and maybe unwilling disciples became willing servants. It was a party where gifts were taken and blessed and broken and given. And we see, if you look throughout the scriptures, we see this as kind of a pattern, God's pattern for life. God takes reluctant people and uses them for God's good purposes. Sometimes there's this pattern in Scripture where God takes, breaks, and blesses. Now we see this in the Old Testament story of Jacob. We talked about Jacob a couple of weeks ago. We forget how his story unfolded and how it played out. Remember Jacob, the conniver, the schemer, the cheater who stole his father's blessing from his older brother Esau, and who also convinced his dim-witted brother to exchange his birthright for a bowl of stew. Jacob who lied and swindled his uncle Laban. Jacob was one who wheeled and dealed his way through life. When we saw him a couple weeks ago, when we last left off, he had a vision in which God said that he would have descendants, and his descendants would have land, and he would be a part of the promises that God made to Isaac and to Abraham. And here's how Jacob's story unfolded. Jacob runs away from home to escape his brother's wrath. And then he starts to return home 20 years later. maybe thinking, maybe Esau has forgotten that whole thing. As he gets closer to home, he receives word that Esau, his brother, is headed right towards him, and he's bringing 400 men with him. And so Jacob does what any good brother would do. He sends bribes to his brother every hour on the hour in the hopes of securing a brotherly truce. And then Jacob does what countless people have done throughout history who find themselves in a bind, who, when they're about to face something terrible or a horrible fate, they pray that prayer, Lord, if you'll get me out of this, I promise I will do better. I'll go to church more. I'll do more. Jacob enlists God into his cause, reminding God of the promise that God would multiply Jacob's descendants. Notice that Jacob turns to God in prayer, but also tries to hedge his bets by sending bribes to his brother. Jacob is still leaning on his own strength, getting by on his own wits, still thinking that he has to take matters into his own hands in order to make things turn out right. Still not trusting that God will come through. And then later there's that night by the Jabbok River. A mysterious stranger appears and wrestles with Jacob. This man or this angelic being dislocates Jacob's hip, but still cannot overcome him. Jacob, ever the bargainer, maybe has the guy in a headlock and tells the man, I'll let you go if you bless me. And the man gives Jacob a new name. Jacob is renamed Israel, which literally means one who wrestles or struggles with God. Now notice that Jacob does not walk away from his encounter with God with a song of praise on his lips and a new lease on life or a spring in his step. Jacob walks away from God limping, broken. In the encounter with the mysterious stranger, whether it was an angelic being or some manifestation of God, Jacob is broken, and then he is blessed. He is broken of his addiction to secure his life by his own means, to depend on his own conniving and his own deception. He is broken of the belief that he is the captain of his own soul. He is broken so that he could receive a blessing and so that he could then be a blessing. Jacob literally learned how to lean on God. And in order to learn how to lean on God, he had to be broken. And his limp was not a sign of weakness or a sign of punishment from God. It was a sign that he had encountered the living God. And this God had left its mark on him. This God had given him a wound, but it was a holy wound. And that turns out to be a kind of pattern for life for God's people. God often enlists reluctant people into God's good purposes. God takes us and then breaks us so that we can then become a blessing that God desires to send out into the world. Pastor Greg Boyd says this, that God often uses our deepest pain as the launching pad for our greatest calling. God often uses our deepest pain as the launching pad for our greatest calling. Several years ago, I was getting lunch with a pastor friend who's now retired, and we were just talking about life and ministry and things that we have learned. And I remember my pastor friend shared with me, he said, I used to look down on people that got divorced, and especially divorced pastors. He said, I was convinced that they just didn't try hard enough. If they'd only stuck with it, stuck together, they would be together, and they should feel a little bit of shame. He said, that was my attitude until my wife of over 15 years walked into the living room one day and announced, I can't do this anymore. I'm done. And he said, no amount of trying and pleading and promising could change the course of my life that day. And now, because of that deeply painful event, I see divorced people in a completely different light. I no longer judge. I have lots more compassion and empathy and understanding. I have a deeper understanding that life is nowhere near as black and white as I once thought it was. Having gone through such a painful ordeal, he had been wounded and broken. But out of this woundedness, out of the brokenness, came blessing. So it is with the God who's been revealed to us in Jesus, who was wounded for us. And by his wounds and out of his wounds comes our healing and redemption. Thanks be to God. Amen.